Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you might happen to be watching this, and a Happy New Year to you. We are really glad to have you with us for this section of Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church Sunday School. As you know, the last Sunday school we went through the books of the Old Testament and a little bit about the intertestamental period. Now, we're going to start with the New Testament. And these are books that are, many of them at least, more familiar to you, certainly more familiar to me because that was my area of doctoral study. So we will look at them and just give them a brief overview. There's lots and lots of other things that we could do to talk. We could talk about. I mean, I could certainly teach the entire semester on the Gospel of Matthew, but we won't. We will just go through them again at a bird's eye view so that you have a sense of what the book is about in general. And if you have further questions, then we can deal with those at another time. So let's begin with the Gospel of Matthew. This is the first book of the New Testament. It's not the first book to be written. It's the first book of the New Testament. Similar to the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament that we looked at, remember that Job is probably the oldest book, but Genesis is the book of beginnings, and thus it comes first. So Matthew comes first. It is attributed to the Apostle Matthew. Now, the thing to remember about the Gospels is that no author is named in the text of any of the Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all without a named author in the text, unlike Romans, for example, where Paul says, I'm writing this letter to you. So the Gospel of Matthew contains a variety of teachings of Jesus in 5 different sections, 5 different speeches of Jesus. And it contains more teachings of Jesus than any other gospel. It contains the Sermon on the Mount, which is this large section of teachings, which I'm sure that you're familiar with. And Matthew is the first of the gospels for a variety of reasons, which we won't have time to get into. But one of them is, just quickly, that it begins with the genealogy and birth of Jesus, much like Luke does. There are only 2 genealogies, one in Matthew and one in Luke. And in almost every set of Gospels that we have in the ancient text, that is handwritten Greek text, whenever there's more than one Gospel, Matthew is almost inevitably first. So if you were to go to a place that had ancient manuscripts, and you were to pick up the 4 Gospels bound together, Matthew would almost certainly be first. There's some thought that the Christians were the one to invent what we call the book today. It was called a codex. And up until that time, everything's written on a scroll. And some Christians wanted to carry the 4 Gospels together, and so someone came up with the idea of having what we today call a book, so that you can carry more pages and so that you can find something that you're looking for much more easily. And so, inevitably, for a variety of reasons, Matthew is the first one that's there. Here we see a person on a mat that has a U on it, so we get Matthew. It's sort of a welcome mat that leads you directly to the King. And the King, of course, is Jesus. And Matthew will present Christ as a new Moses, a better Moses, a Messiah, the ultimate Messiah. And so we will look at a few things in Matthew and understand what's going on there. If you want an introduction to Matthew, and I'll be offering book suggestions along the way, since I'm much more familiar with the written material about the New Testament. If you want an introduction to Matthew, there's a book by R.T. France called Matthew, Evangelist and Teacher. The one that I have is from 1989. There may be a new edition since then. But it's a wonderful sort of introduction to all of the issues surrounding Matthew. It'll talk about authorship, it'll talk about date, it'll talk about place of writing, all kinds of things like that. So it's a very, very good sort of introduction to that one particular gospel, and there are other introductory books like that for the other gospels. For a good devotional commentary, that is a commentary that you just want to read through quickly. You don't want to deal with textual issues or the Greek text or anything like that. R.T. France's work in the Tyndale Biblical Commentary, it's a little paperback book about maybe 150 to 200 pages. That's a good, very good devotional commentary. It deals very carefully with the text by a Matthean scholar, but it's not overwhelming. One of the things that I will tell you that when you get to Matthew 24 in France's book, you may be surprised at the position, the millennial position that he argues for. You know, of course, that Matthew 24 is where Matthew begins to answer questions about what's going to happen in the future. And France does a very good job of arguing, I think, for a different kind of position there. If you want a very technical commentary, a very good commentary that's going to deal with serious issues like textual issues and grammatical issues in Matthew's gospel, there are two. One is Hagner. It's the Word Biblical Commentary. It's 2 volumes. You can get it on Logos, you can get it in paperback, you can get it on Kindle. There are a variety of different ways that you can get it. But it's a fascinating work and one that I think you would find helpful. Even more technical is the sort of magnum opus of Matthean commentaries, Davis and Allison. And it's 3 volumes, International Critical Commentary, or ICC. And it deals with virtually every textual issue, every grammatical issue, every cultural issue, deals with it very carefully. And so I would not suggest that you buy those 3 volumes unless a couple of things. One, if you have enough money, because they're very expensive. I think they're like $80 retail a piece for each of the 3 volumes. And secondly, if you're going to do an in-depth study of Matthew, that would be the reason that you would want to buy the 3 volumes. Other than that, like the France volume is probably going to be much more helpful to you as you sort of read through the book of Matthew in a devotional way. Let's think then about the authorship of Matthew. I've already told you that the Gospels are anonymous. That is, there's no place in Matthew where Matthew says, I'm the tax collector that's writing this. No place in Mark where Mark says, I listened to the preaching of Peter and I wrote it down and here it is. There's nothing like that. Nothing in Luke that says, I'm Luke, I'm a doctor, and I'm writing this gospel down for you. All of the Gospels, including John, they're anonymous. And as a result of that, we don't know for certain who wrote them. So there's a difference between anonymous and what might be called pseudographical. Pseudographical would be claiming that someone wrote a book. For example, there are those in New Testament scholarship who would argue that Paul didn't write, for example, Ephesians. Now, in the book of Ephesians, the letter of Ephesians, Paul himself claims, I am writing this to you. So it's not anonymous in that sense. If Paul didn't write it, then someone is lying about having written it, or at least being disingenuous about who actually wrote the book. So keep that in mind. There's a difference there. And the issue is that we don't know who wrote the Gospels. We just can't say. And we have to be comfortable with that. Now, there's a statement by a very early scholar named Papias, or Papias, you'll hear his name pronounced both ways. And he says that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew and then eventually translated into Greek. I don't think that that's the case, and there are a variety of technical reasons that I won't bother you with. It may be that there was something written by Matthew in Hebrew early on, a sort of pre-gospel that Papias was referring to. I don't know. The problem is we don't have any copies of a Hebrew Matthew. All we have are the Greek copies. And so I tend to think that it's possible there was some kind of an early portion of Matthew or something like that that was floating around, but we have no evidence for it. And so I think Papias is certainly the entire gospel was not written by in Hebrew by Matthew early on. So let's think about some arguments for Matthean authorship. How do we know, or why would we think that Matthew wrote the gospel? First of all, let's imagine the theological implications of the question. Realize that these gospels are anonymous. Therefore, if Matthew the tax collector didn't write it, it has no theological implications. We're not devaluing the authority of Scripture or anything like that, very simply because of the fact that the text is what we hold to be authoritative, and it never says that Matthew wrote the text. So the theological implication of the question is that there is none. Somebody wrote this book. It was inspired by the Holy Spirit, and it may very well have been Matthew. I'm willing to say that the early church held that it was Matthew, and it very likely was, but we can't say that with any degree of certainty in the same sense that we say Paul wrote Romans or something like that. So what then leads us to believe that Matthew was the writer of this gospel? One of the questions is, if you look at a Greek New Testament, you'll see that Matthew occurs, then there's a heading or a title, and up above the beginning of the text in Matthew 1:1 is according to Matthew. And so one of the things that we ask is, how long did the gospel circulate without that title? Or who and when added that title? Who added it and when did they add it? We don't know. There are some who argue, and the argument is at least worth looking into, that the Gospels never circulated without a title. And as a result of that, we should think that the title is a part of the text, and therefore that Matthew did really write the Gospel. There's no proof of that, but it's an interesting argument. The early church held to Matthean authorship. This is a much stronger argument in my view, or I should say much of the early church. The early church was like the church today. Nobody agreed on everything. But the early church, most of them at least, argued that Matthew the tax collector did indeed write this. So as a result of that, that's at least a fairly strong piece in favor of the authorship of Matthew. Both Irenaeus and Papias, whom we've already talked about, held to Matthean authorship. And so you might ask me, well, if you're not willing to accept Papias' statement that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, why are you willing to accept the statement that Matthew wrote it? And fair enough, it's an interesting question. If there was some sort of early Hebrew piece of Matthew that was floating around, that may be what Papias was referring to. But at any rate, we have very, very early claims of Matthean authorship, and that's what we want to hold on to. So we don't, in any sense, know for certain that Matthew wrote it, but there are certainly good pieces of evidence. The date of Matthew. There are three essentially different periods of time in which Matthew's gospel has been dated. The latest is from about 80 to 90 A.D. And they argue this because of its relationship with Mark. And keep in mind that there are 4 gospels, but 3 of them are called synoptic gospels. Synoptic, syn means together, like a symphony, S-Y-N. Not S-I-N, symphony, symphonic, anything like that. Optic means to see, so synoptic means the 3 gospels that see Jesus together. That is, they tell many of the same stories. So if you were to want to learn about the baptism of Jesus, you could look at the baptismal account in Matthew, the baptismal account in Mark, and the baptismal account in Luke, and what you would find is that they're all telling the same story. Many stories in the synoptic gospels are like that, and so you can compare and contrast them and get an idea of what their author was trying to put forward, what points they were trying to put forward. So since the gospel depends on Mark, if you want to date Mark late, then you must date Matthew later. And I should say that not everybody thinks that Matthew depended upon Mark. It's probably 80 to more percent of New Testament scholars do, but there are a few outliers that don't. So that's the issue. There are two problems with this argument, though. One is that Jesus predicts the destruction of Jerusalem. And you can see it in Matthew 22 as an example. Matthew 24, of course, he says, not one stone will be standing upon another. And so I want you to realize that Matthew is a book about fulfillment. He says, this was fulfilled, that was fulfilled, this was fulfilled. Fulfillment is one of Matthew's favorite words, particularly in the first part of the gospel. And so I would argue that if Jesus had predicted the destruction of the temple and it had already happened, then Matthew would certainly have told us about that. He would have said the temple was destroyed in order to fulfill what Jesus said, but he doesn't. He leaves us there without the temple destroyed. And so it seems to me that the fact that he leaves the temple undestroyed indicates that he may have been writing before the temple was destroyed. The second argument is the use of the term until today. And some have argued that this indicates a long time between the event and the writing. But we don't know that. I mean, it could be 6 months, it could be 6 years. It doesn't necessarily have to be 40 or 50 years, as those who would argue for the late date of the writing of Matthew. So I'm not convinced that Matthew was written so late as 80 or 90 A.D. What then about arguments for a date before A.D. 70, which would essentially be before the destruction of the temple? 67, 68 A.D. is the destruction of the temple. So first, there's what many call anti-Judaism in the book. I don't think that that's really what it is. I think really what is going on there is that Matthew is pointing out the problems with the Jewish leadership and the hatred that they had for Jesus. He's not anti-Semitic in any way, which is a claim that is often made in synoptic circles. But the fact that he's willing to point out the flaws of the Pharisees and the Sadducees may point to a time when the church had fully separated from Judaism. So remember that at one point, if you had said to Matthew, are you Jewish or are you a Christian? Matthew would have said, yes, I'm Jewish and I'm a follower of the Messiah named Jesus Christ. So there wouldn't have been any distinction between the Jewishness and Christianity. But as time went on, there came to be a separation of the ways, and there are reasons for that to happen that I won't get into now. But there came a time when Judaism and Christianity simply were two different branches. They were no longer together. And so we don't know exactly when that took place. One of the interesting things in Matthew is that often Matthew will say, we went to their synagogue. And it may be that Matthew is simply saying we went to their synagogue in the way that we might say we went to their church. I went to visit my brother and we went to their church. On the other hand, it may be that Matthew is saying we are no longer members of the synagogue. We have become something different. And so their synagogues are for those who are Jewish, and we have a different place of meeting. It's an interesting thing for you to look at and study. The patristic tradition of Irenaeus dates the gospel in the early 60s. So Irenaeus would date the gospel from about 60 to 65, somewhere around in there. And remember, these dates are a little fluid. But he would date the gospel fairly early in terms of the writing of the New Testament. And so since Irenaeus is early, it seems to us that he has evidence that we don't know of. A third is the forward-looking references to the destruction of Jerusalem. We've already talked about that. And it seems impossible that Matthew would have simply allowed the destruction of Jerusalem to happen and not written about it. Another thing is that there's no sign in Matthew that any of the Pauline epistles were known. Matthew doesn't know anything about Romans or the Corinthians or Galatia. He doesn't know anything about that. And at least as far as we can tell. And as a result, it seems as if those letters hadn't made their way around to wherever the Matthean community was. Gundry has a commentary on Matthew, which is good. It has some issues, but it's a good commentary, and Gundry is a good scholar. He has a fairly impressive list of specific passages which point to the period before AD 70. So you can go to the library and look at Gundry's commentary on Matthew, or find it perhaps on Google Books, and look at that list of passages that Gundry has where he says these indicate that Matthew was looking ahead to the Jewish war, not back on it as having already happened. All of that leads me to believe that Matthew was written between 60 and 70. That's an early date, I know, but it's not terribly early. And so that's the position that I will hold. Let's think about the style of Matthew's gospel. How was it written? Matthew's gospel is balanced in structure and style. It's very carefully composed book. And Matthew focuses his gospel on the sayings of Jesus. And so you will find in the gospel 5 different speeches of Jesus, each of them having to do with this or that. For example, you have the Sermon on the Mount. You have the speech on forgiveness that's in the latter part of 17, 18, 19. All of that goes to show us that Matthew is carefully composing this book. It's not as if he just writes down whatever comes to him. It's very, very carefully written. What about the structure of Matthew? There are a variety of different ways that people have decided to look at Matthew's structure. Some have simply looked at the geographical or chronological approach. It begins with Jesus' birth, Jesus travels around, ends with his death. That's a simplistic way of looking at it, but that's certainly one way. Others have looked at as a sort of 5-fold approach. 5 speeches of Jesus, therefore 5 sections of Matthew in which he wants to tell us about big issues. Others, like the scholar Kingsbury, have seen the gospel as divided into 3 different positions, and like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Others have said that the geography tells us how to structure Matthew. If we look for mountains in Matthew, each of the mountains that happen in Matthew are very, very important. So there's the Mount of Temptation at the beginning. There's a Mount of the Sermon. There's a Mount of Transfiguration. There's a Mount of Crucifixion. There are 7 mountains in Matthew's gospel. And some have argued that that's the way that Matthew wanted us to understand it. Then there is an eclectic approach, just saying that all of these things point to ways that Matthew wanted us to understand the gospel, and that we can look at all of them as a way of understanding the structure. What does Matthew have to say to us at the end of the day? The key word for Matthew is righteousness. Matthew is very important in the things that Jesus says about righteousness. Remember that it's in Matthew that Jesus says, if your righteousness does not exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, some have tried to make that imputed righteousness, that is, the righteousness that comes from Christ. I don't find that to be quite right in terms of the whole context of Matthew's gospel. I think that Matthew is saying to us, if you are not more righteous than the scribes and Pharisees, if you don't act better than they do, then something is wrong with you. And so you can read through, you can see what the scribes and Pharisees did. And we should stop here to just make a point, and that is that the scribes and Pharisees in Matthew's Gospels are not necessarily representative of all the scribes and Pharisees. It may be that the Pharisees in Matthew's Gospel are particularly egregious and hateful toward Jesus, and not all Pharisees were. So keep that in mind as you read through the book of Matthew. Look for the word righteousness. Matthew also talks about the church. he's the only one of the Gospels to talk about the church. He mentions the term church 3 times in the Gospel, and that's the only place that we see it. And in Matthew 18, we see instructions for church discipline. Again, the only place where we see that kind of thing going on. In Matthew, Jesus gives 5 great speeches, and we've already talked about this, but here are the 5 great speeches: the Sermon on the Mount, the parables in Matthew 13, forgiveness in Matthew 18, the Pharisees in Matthew 20 and 21, and the Olivet Discourse in 24 and 25. You'll find that these are pretty long speeches given by Jesus teaching on a different kind of a subject. Interestingly, the genealogy in Matthew speaks of Gentile women. There are 4 women in Matthew's genealogy found in Matthew 1. And it was unusual to find women in a genealogy during this time. Rarely would you find women in a genealogy. And yet, not counting Mary, Matthew has 4 women in that genealogy. Very interesting. You have Rahab, who was a harlot. You have Tamar, who had issues with her individual life. You have Ruth, who was an outsider. And then the 4th woman is not even mentioned. She is said to be the wife of Uriah. It is Bathsheba. And it's almost as if the writer of the genealogy is so ashamed of what David and Bathsheba did that he doesn't even mention her name, but she is in there. There have been a variety of different ideas put forth as to why these 4 women occur in the genealogy of Matthew's gospel. Some say it's because they were all outsiders. Some say it's because they all had serious sexual sins. Some say other kinds of things. But whatever it is, it's interesting that the very first representation of the genealogy of our God has these 4 women. And at least some of them were not the kind of people that you would want to put in your own family tree. If you could choose your family tree, I'm certain that there are some people that you would want to leave out. Jesus did get to choose his own family tree. And yet, he didn't leave those people out, but he almost placarded them, saying, even if your life is like one of these people, I'm still the Messiah. I'm still here to offer you forgiveness. There are a variety of key passages in Matthew. Of course, there's the genealogy. Then there's the wise men. Remember, the shepherds occur in Luke. The wise men occur in Matthew. The wise men came probably a couple of years after the birth of Jesus. It wasn't when Jesus was a little tiny baby. There's the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5, 6, and 7. Wonderful. The greatest sermon ever preached, and it's do you world of good to read just, if nothing else, the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew has some things to say about divorce, first in the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5, and then later in his writing in chapter 19, Jesus has things to say about that. Then Matthew has things to say about forgiveness. I think that forgiveness is one of the overriding issues that Matthew wants to have Jesus put forward in his gospel. That no matter how broken any of us are, there's always a God who is ready to offer us forgiveness. Realize that in the first chapter of Matthew, Mary is told that she will call this child that she is about to have Emmanuel, which means God with us. In Hebrew, Emmanuel means God with us. My old professor at Knox Seminary, many, many years ago, he said to the class, Emmanuel, God with us. I will never understand that. He said, I can understand God against us. I can understand God hates us. I can understand God is angry with us for what we've done. But God with us, that I will never be able to understand. And so Matthew is the gospel of God with us. And let each of us read it and understand that Jesus Christ was the God-man who came down to offer us forgiveness and to be with us. He didn't come down to be angry with us. He didn't come down to be mad at us. He came down to be with us. And for that, we can all be most incredibly thankful. Thanks so much for watching. Next week, we'll be looking at the Gospel of Mark together. And we'll go through each of the 4 Gospels. Then we'll look at the rest of the New Testament. So, if you have any questions, you can write me at Lamerson, that's Slamerson, at knoxseminary.edu. If you have a question, send it in, and I will try to answer it on the next Sunday school. I can't answer each one individually, but I'll do my best to try to answer at least some of the questions during the Sunday school the next time. I miss not having the give and take of questions and answers, so if you have a question, please, again, send it to Lamerson, just like my name, Sam Lamerson, at knoxseminary.edu. If you forget that, just go to knoxseminary.edu, search for my name, and you'll be able to find my email without any trouble. Thanks so much for watching. I look forward to next week when we look at the Gospel of Mark. Until then, stay safe, read your Bible, and understand that we worship a God who is with us. Thanks so much from Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church Sunday School.